Hi guys, this is Anna, one of your TAs for the summer semester. And today I have the privilege of being able to talk to you guys about deviance and social control for your second to last lecture. So congratulations for being almost done. I hope that it's been good up to this point and that I can help you out again today. So before we get started, I kind of want to talk about some basic definitions that are associated with what we're talking about today. So for one, let's talk about social control. So social control is a set of rules or standards in our society that keep individuals bound to a social norm. So this can be our laws or our morals, values, just kind of the place we've come to as a society with what we believe is right or wrong, or what we've outlined as right or wrong, to keep us from essentially running around like chickens with our heads cut off. So we have some sort of system that tells us that this is okay, this is not okay, and we can keep things, as it says, under control. And before I explain deviance and crime, I want to address the kind of issue that we have whenever we look at these two things, because a lot of people use these two terms interchangeably, and that's just not accurate. So I would argue that maybe not all, but most crimes are deviant acts, but not all deviant acts are crime. So deviance is an act or behavior that counteracts social norms, and it could very well be a criminal behavior, as extreme as maybe armed robbery, right? But it can also be as simple as picking your nose in public, something that we as a society have deemed maybe unclean or just unacceptable to do. Not something that you just walk up to someone and start sticking your finger up your nose, right? That is something that we consider deviant. We consider not to fit under our status quo. But if we're looking at crime, crime is different because crime is actually outlined in our laws as something that isn't okay. So it's legally defined as something that can be punishable by the law. And we all know an example of a crime, but just to make sure, reiterate, an example would be maybe speeding, or anything, like I said, for an earlier example, for something that could be deviant would be an armed robbery, right? So crime itself also has a very widespread kind of spectrum of what it can be, but deviance, it covers a little bit more because it doesn't have to be an illegal act. So if we look at the pictures over here, the top one is a man who's yelling at his waitress. Maybe his food wasn't how he liked it or something, but it's not illegal for him to address something with her and raise his voice and be rude, right? But it's not nice, and it's deviant. We label it as deviant because it's not necessarily okay, or as so we feel morally. And the bottom one is both deviant and criminal because these are some kids who are underage drinking. So that's something they can be punished by law for, but it's also something that isn't morally right according to our social norm in society. So we're going to be covering 5 different theories today that kind of talk about deviance more closely, of maybe why it happens, why it doesn't happen, or what the effects are. And then after we finish up that, we're going to talk about total institutions, more specifically our prisons, and why we have prisons. What are the functions? So starting with Hershey's social control theory, unlike under the other theories that we're going to be covering, this explains why we don't deviate as individuals in our society. So this is talking about the factors that we have that link us to our communities that keep us from participating in these deviant acts. So an example of this would be our attachment. This is one of the factors that describes our connections to others. So our family, our friends, maybe significant others, teachers, just important people in our lives who keep us from doing these things. Or commitment. So commitment is talking about our investments in our community. So our career, maybe some volunteer work we do, or us as students, our school. And if we look at involvement, that's more the participation that we have in different things in our community, such as sports, like you can see down below, or up above that, church. That would be something else we can be involved in, or maybe clubs. And then lastly, our values in society. So what we feel is wrong or right morally will keep us from hopefully doing those things that we feel is wrong. If we look at Sutherland's differential association theory, this is more so about individuals who learn through their interactions with others. This is very much about our socialization and how our interactions that we have with the people we surround ourselves with are very are possibly detrimental to our values, attitudes, techniques, and motives for criminal behavior. So if we're surrounding ourselves with people who participate in deviant behavior or criminal behaviors, then we're more likely ourselves to participate in those things because of this idea of peer pressure, right? So down below, that really drills in the idea of peer pressure of this person who's maybe a little apprehensive to do something, but all of these people are egging him on, like, go on, do it. Maybe they're saying it won't be that bad. You won't get in trouble, something like that. And the top is like a literal example of this, of maybe at a party where someone is handed a drink and they don't feel comfortable, they're underage, but they drink because everyone else is drinking. And it can also be in everyday life, something such as like just the mannerisms that we pick up on. So how we respond, what we say, how we act, all of those things. And the labeling theory is not so much about the acts that people commit as much as it is the reactions that we as a society have to them. So deviance, something important to note about deviance is that deviance is constantly changing. Something that we believed was not, or I'm sorry, something that we believed was deviant maybe 50 years ago is not necessarily deviant now. Like interracial relationships. It wasn't until within the past few decades or so, I don't remember the exact date, but up until that point, you couldn't marry someone of a different race. And now we see that all the time. And it's not weird, it's not bad, but there was a time where we thought it was. There was a time when our society didn't think it was okay for people of two different races to get married. So labeling theory also can be broken down into primary versus secondary deviance. So primary isn't such a big deal. It's a violation of norms that don't have any long-term effects on a person. So this could be skipping school for a day, right? Like maybe you just don't really feel good. You just don't feel like going, kind of just want to take a day to yourself. You don't show up to school, no big deal. That's not going to make or break you. But secondary deviants are actions that are long-term labeled deviant, and a person in particular being labeled these things because of these acts that they're doing that people find deviant. So if someone were to continuously skip school, then they're likely to carry these labels of maybe someone who doesn't care about their education, don't have their priorities in line, irresponsible, those kinds of things. And then there's this idea of self-fulfilling prophecy. So say a teacher who notices that the student hasn't been coming to school, like starts calling them a troublemaker, kind of has these like negative things they say to them that they feel about them. Well, whenever those things occur, whenever the student does something to get in trouble, then it just kind of reinforces the whole idea of what was being said before by the teacher. So it's something that was kind of predicted, a false expectation that ends up being confirmed later on. And stigma is just another name for the powerful labels that become a part of one's identity, like any of the things above that we've been saying. And this over here shows an individual who has been called a lot of really ugly things. And she begins to feel that she is those things because that's all she's being told. And after you're told that you are these things or the things you do are negative in some sort of way, it just kind of becomes part of who you identify yourself as. So for Durkheim's functionalist theory, this one talks about how deviance doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing. Deviance serves a number of functions for our society. So for one, it affirms our cultural values and norms. So it kind of puts in perspective and reminds us this is what we feel is right, this is what we feel is wrong, and keeps that balance and keeps us moving along as a society, like knowing our place, knowing what is and is not acceptable. And this kind of goes along with the next one. Responding to deviance clarifies moral boundaries. So if we see that someone is getting punished for something that we have deemed unacceptable in society or getting backlash for it, then that kind of clarifies where we stand in the sense of, oh, we don't want to do that because we don't want to be treated or labeled or just associated the same way that the person before was. But it's important to note that responding to deviance can also just bring people together. So take, for example, the civil rights movement. So the picture that I show you is Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on a bus as a Black lady for a white person. And this, in its time, was very unokay in our society. And looking back, it's ridiculous, right? But uh, we couldn't change that until people came together and they worked toward responding to that. So all these people who saw these injustices of how Blacks were being treated versus whites, that leads into the next thing, which encouraged social change, encouraged by people coming together and working for the changes that they needed to see. They were committing deviant acts because they were going against what we had already established as society was or was not okay. They were doing what we thought wasn't okay, but eventually we came around to realize, oh, maybe we had it all wrong. And those changes were made. If we look at Merton's strain theory, this is the idea that maybe most of us in society have similar goals on what we want to be, what we want to do, how we want to be perceived, but we don't all have the same ability or means to meet those goals maybe. So you can see the car right there on the top. I've included like a kind of dual car, right? On the left side, you can see this red car that's not nearly as nice as the one on the right side, the blue. But I mean, they may both take you to point A to point B, but it's probably likely that the blue side is going to be a little more sustainable because it's a little pricier, it's a little nicer, maybe new from the lot, where the red side, not so much. Maybe it already has some issues. Maybe it just won't last as long because it's not sustainable, but that's all that another person can afford. So the big idea under this is that there's either an abundance of resources or a lack of resources in different areas, but the lack of resources that some people have can really cause a huge strain on their communities and themselves as individuals. And Merton gives us 5 different reactions to the strain caused by resource gaps. So number 1 would be conformity. So these are what I would argue the most typical kind of pattern that we see. The individuals who go along with the acceptable ways of society try to pursue their goals through socially accepted standards. So this is us right now as students. We're working toward getting our degree, maybe for our career goals, and hopefully to make a decent amount of money with a successful job, right? Well, if we look at innovation, these are individuals who pursue goals by deviant and often criminal means. So someone who is not doing things the socially accepted way as we are by going to school. This could be someone who like maybe didn't want to go to school or maybe didn't have the resources to go to school. So in order to try to get the same kind of paychecks that we'll be seeing in the future, whenever we graduate and have a college degree job, maybe someone has to sell drugs because that's how they're going to get sustainable money to live the life that they want to live, just like we want to live. When we look at ritualism, these are the individuals who lower their goals so that they are able to reach them by socially acceptable means. So maybe these are the people who are unable to go to school because they don't have the resources to do it. So instead of thinking that they're going to go to university and get their degree in something, they are more so maybe working their way up in a fast food chain, right? Something that they lower their standards because they're not doing necessarily what they wanted to do because they don't feel that they have the resources to do the said thing, but they're working toward something similar by lowering their goals. So instead of being a doctor, they're going to try to be a general manager, work their way up to that position, something like that. Also socially acceptable. And then if we look at retreatism, these are the individuals who retreat from society's goals. So the people who, I think your book mentions maybe beggars, right? So people who have kind of gone away from what we as a society deem as financially stable, and they start begging for their money instead. And then lastly, we have rebellion. So these are the individuals who rebel and attempt to replace the society's goals with their own. So this is maybe what we saw a while ago, or currently, I'm sorry, about our minimum wage. There's a lot of people who are refusing to work because they can't live off of the low wages. So what they're doing is they're refusing to have a sustainable or maybe long-term career, stable career, because it doesn't make sense for them. And until they see those differences and the pay gap or pay wage, whatever, they're kind of doing the deviant thing by not working, by collecting unemployment, right? Doing something else that we don't necessarily deem like the typical way, the acceptable way, but until they replace society's goals with what they feel is necessary, this is what they do. So moving on to total institution, these are our prisons and maybe some jails. But a total institution is a place where people are cut off from society for a decent period of time. So under this, we see two phenomenons that I want to discuss. And one of them is degradation. And these are acts that mark the inmate as deviant. So whenever people are in the prisons, this is kind of like the labeling theory, right? If we're marking someone as deviant or as criminal or as wrong, this is what degradation is. It's negatively influencing this person or talking about this person or saying things about them that degrade them, that make them feel like less of a person. And we see that a lot in these kinds of scenarios. Or also mortification. And this is described as the acts that break down the individual's original self as the inmate experiences resocialization. So as you see on the bottom picture there, everyone who's in their jumpsuits. This is kind of a big thing because whenever they have their jumpsuits, they're wearing the same thing every day. They don't really get to express themselves with what they wear. Maybe like how they accessorize themselves prior to being locked away. But prisons are necessary, right? And these are the four main reasons that we've deemed them functional in our society. And number one is protection. So the idea that people who have committed these crimes, like maybe a sexual assault case, a sexual predator, we feel should be locked away because if they aren't able to access society, they're not able to keep committing those crimes and hurt society. We also have punishment, which this is, I feel, the most basic reason, fundamental reason that we started these things is because we want people to understand that what they did is wrong and quote unquote pay for what they did. We also have deterrence. And this is the idea of we're discouraging other people from committing crimes because of, and general deterrence, this is the idea of maybe one person is locked away for a crime, so no one else is going to want to do it because they see the effects that it had on a specific person. But specific deterrence is more so that individual who's being locked away, and that person specifically is probably not going to repeat those crimes if they get out because they had that experience personally. And then rehabilitation, this is the idea of maybe helping the criminal become a better person or learn better ways of doing things. So this is more restorative justice of, I think more so when it comes to addiction, right? So maybe instead of a total institution as a prison necessarily, or I mean, even in a prison, the programs that we offer, or like a rehab center, we're trying to break those addictions, for example. We're trying to help that person to break the cycle of what they've been doing so that whenever they are reintegrated into society, they can live a more productive life without pursuing those same activities. So that's all that I have for you guys. And I hope that it all made sense, was all helpful to you, helped kind of explain a little of where we're coming from when we talk about social control or deviant acts, the difference between deviant and criminal. And of course, if you guys have any questions, you can definitely reach out to me, send me a message on ACE, or my email is on the overview page, and you can definitely shoot me an email. Anything I can do to help. I wish you guys the best of luck with this lesson, and Yeah, thank you for listening. Thank you for having me.